Some people think the most dangerous thing about a dam is the water behind it. They never stop to ask what happens after it is gone. The sharp crack of a pneumatic nail gun echoed across the valley before the first rays of sunlight reached the top of the earthen dam. I looked up from my morning coffee just in time to see two contractors driving a bright red violation sign into the ground near the old spillway. Fresh dirt scattered across the grass, while the metallic pounding bounced off the water like distant thunder. One final swing of the hammer, and there it was in bold black letters large enough to read from my porch. $50,000 homeowners association fine. Unauthorized water structure. I stood there without saying a word, letting the cool morning breeze carry the familiar scent of wet soil, pine trees, and lake water that had filled my lungs since I was a little boy. The reservoir behind the dam reflected the orange glow of sunrise so perfectly it looked like polished glass. Ducks drifted across the surface without the slightest idea that a group of people in expensive polo shirts believed this peaceful place was somehow a neighborhood violation. Then I heard slow applause behind me. Karen Dawson walked toward the dam wearing spotless white sneakers that had probably never touched real mud before that morning. She carried a leather folder stamped with the Homeowners Association logo and smiled as though she had just won an election instead of starting a fight she did not understand. "You had plenty of time to remove this eyesore," she said with that polished voice people use when they think paperwork makes them invincible. "Now the community will finally get the scenic walking trail it deserves." A few board members nodded behind her while someone unfolded colorful concept drawings showing picnic tables, decorative benches, flower gardens, and a paved pathway running directly across the top of the dam. They admired the sketches like children looking at a new playground. None of them looked beyond the water. None of them looked downstream. My name is Caleb Harrison. I am 41 years old, a civil engineer, and the third generation of my family to care for this piece of land outside Fort Collins, Colorado. Long before luxury homes appeared beyond the tree line, my grandfather built this earthen dam with county engineers after a devastating flood changed this valley forever. My father spent his weekends inspecting the spillway, clearing debris, and checking drainage channels before every rainy season. When I inherited the property, I inherited that responsibility too. Standing there with the smell of damp earth surrounding me and the sound of gentle water flowing through the overflow pipe, I realized Karen saw nothing more than an old pile of dirt blocking her neighborhood's expansion plans. She believed she had found an abandoned structure worth $50,000 in fines. What she had actually found was the one piece of infrastructure quietly protecting every single house she claimed to represent, and she had just announced to the entire county that she intended to make it disappear. After Karen and the board members finally walked away, the valley became quiet again. The only sounds left were the soft trickle of water flowing through the concrete outlet pipe and the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves along the shoreline. I stayed where I was, staring across the reservoir while the morning sun climbed higher over the foothills. From a distance, the dam looked almost ordinary. A long ridge of compacted earth covered with thick grass, wildflowers growing along the edges, a gravel maintenance road running across the crest. Most people drove past it without giving it a second thought. That was exactly how my grandfather wanted it. He used to tell me that the best engineering disappears into the landscape. If people notice it every day, somebody probably designed it wrong. My grandfather, William Harrison, built that dam in the early 1970s after a spring flood turned half this valley into a shallow lake. Back then there were no luxury homes, no community entrance signs, and certainly no homeowners association. There were ranches, cattle, and families trying to rebuild after weeks of standing water-destroyed fields and washed-out county roads. He worked alongside county engineers, heavy equipment operators, and local volunteers for nearly 2 years, shaping thousands of cubic yards of earth into a structure that could quietly manage runoff from the mountains every rainy season. My father inherited the responsibility long before he inherited the land. Every spring he inspected the spillway before the snowpack melted. Every autumn he cleared branches from the drainage channel before winter storms arrived. Some of my earliest memories involve following him along the top of the dam, carrying a toolbox almost too heavy for my small hands. The smell of wet clay, fresh-cut grass, diesel fuel, and cold mountain water still reminds me of Saturday mornings with him. When he passed away 6 years ago, I inherited more than 200 acres of family property. I also inherited every inspection log, maintenance record, engineering drawing, and handwritten notebook he had carefully stored inside an old steel filing cabinet in the workshop. I never questioned the responsibility because I understood what the dam really represented. It was never about creating a pretty pond or increasing property value. It was about slowing water before gravity could turn it into disaster downstream. That understanding eventually shaped my own career. I became a civil engineer because I wanted to build things that quietly protected people without asking for recognition. Flood control systems, drainage channels, retaining structures, and watershed management became my specialty. I spent years designing infrastructure that most drivers never even noticed. Standing beside the reservoir that morning, I could not help noticing how different Karen saw the world. She looked at the dam and imagined walking trails, decorative benches, and better neighborhood views. I looked at the same structure and saw decades of hydrology, soil mechanics, drainage calculations, and thousands of families sleeping peacefully during every major storm because somebody had planned ahead. The strange part was that neither of us had changed the landscape. The only difference between us was that I knew the story hidden beneath the grass, and she had already decided it was not worth learning. Karen Dawson had only lived in the neighborhood for 4 years, yet somehow she spoke about the valley as though she had personally invented it. She was 53 years old, a successful real estate broker before becoming president of the Homeowners Association, and she had a remarkable talent for making personal preferences sound like community necessities. Every monthly board meeting seemed to end with another improvement proposal: decorative fences, new lighting, expanded walking trails, scenic overlooks. Everything was presented with colorful renderings and polished speeches about increasing property values. Most homeowners applauded because they saw cleaner streets and prettier landscapes. Very few of them ever asked what those projects might replace. Karen's newest vision centered on the reservoir beside my property. She called it an underutilized recreational opportunity. During one meeting, she stood in front of a projector screen displaying digital drawings of families walking across the top of the dam, children eating lunch beside flower gardens, and cyclists following a paved trail around the shoreline. She described the earthen structure as an abandoned mound that interrupted the natural beauty of the community. Listening from the back of the room, I almost smiled at the irony. The very thing she called unnatural had been built to preserve the landscape she admired. By the end of the presentation, the board unanimously approved a beautification initiative that included removing what they described as unnecessary barriers around the reservoir. Several homeowners congratulated Karen afterward, thanking her for making the neighborhood more attractive. Nobody asked why the barrier existed in the first place. A week later, certified letters arrived in my mailbox. The first demanded immediate removal of the dam. The second listed a $50,000 violation for maintaining what they claimed was an unauthorized water structure. The third warned of escalating penalties if corrective action did not begin within 30 days. I read each page carefully while sitting at my kitchen table. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room, and outside the kitchen window, I could hear geese landing gently on the reservoir behind the house. Every sentence in those letters treated the dam as though it were a landscaping feature built on a whim instead of a functioning piece of flood infrastructure. Karen even included a handwritten note at the bottom of one page. The community deserves a better view. I folded the documents neatly and placed them beside my father's old maintenance journals without writing a single response. Later that afternoon, a survey crew hired by the Homeowners Association arrived near the crest of the dam, carrying measuring wheels and bright orange flags. They walked across the grass discussing future trail alignments while occasionally pointing toward the spillway with puzzled expressions. From my porch, I watched them work without interruption. They measured distance. They measured elevation. They measured scenery. What they never measured was water. As the evening sun reflected across the quiet reservoir, I realized Karen believed she had already won because she controlled meetings, budgets, and neighborhood votes. She had no idea that the one thing she considered an obstacle had been designed decades earlier to solve a problem she had never even imagined. I never answered Karen's letters. That confused her more than any argument ever could have. People who enjoy authority usually expect resistance because resistance gives them something to defeat. Silence leaves them guessing. Every morning, I walked the crest of the dam with the same routine my father had followed for decades. I checked the concrete spillway for debris. I measured the reservoir level against the painted staff gauge near the outlet pipe. I inspected the drainage channel below the embankment, where clean water continued flowing at a steady pace. The cool mountain air carried the scent of damp grass and pine needles, while red-winged blackbirds perched along the reeds at the water's edge. Everything functioned exactly as it had for years. The only thing that had changed was the stack of violation notices waiting on my kitchen counter. Karen mistook my routine for surrender. Within another week, the Homeowners Association hired an environmental consultant to evaluate what they kept calling an unnecessary obstruction. I watched from across the reservoir as the consultant walked along the shoreline taking photographs, while Karen enthusiastically pointed toward places where she imagined picnic tables and decorative landscaping. She spoke with absolute confidence about increasing recreational space, improving neighborhood appeal, and removing outdated infrastructure. Every sentence focused on appearance. Not once did I hear the words runoff, watershed, retention, or floodplain. That afternoon, another certified envelope arrived. The Homeowners Association had scheduled a public hearing to discuss legal action if I refused to remove the dam voluntarily. I placed the letter beside the others without opening my laptop or calling an attorney. Instead, I unlocked the old steel filing cabinet in my workshop. The familiar smell of aged paper, machine oil, and cedar shelves filled the room as I lifted out thick binders my father had labeled in careful handwriting decades earlier. Annual inspection reports, soil compaction records, original engineering sketches, maintenance logs dating back more than 40 years. Beneath those sat several large blueprint tubes sealed with faded county engineering department labels. Dust drifted through the afternoon sunlight as I carefully unrolled the first set across my workbench. Detailed cross-sections of the embankment stretched across the page in blue ink, complete with drainage layers, emergency spillway elevations, and official approval stamps. Another tube contained watershed calculations showing rainfall runoff from thousands of acres above the valley. A third held correspondence between my grandfather and county engineers discussing seasonal flood control shortly after the devastating flood that inspired the project. My pulse stayed calm because the story hidden inside those documents was beginning to reveal itself one page at a time. Outside, Karen's survey flags still dotted the grassy crest as though the future had already been decided. Inside my workshop, decades of engineering history quietly waited beneath my hands. For the first time since the violation notice appeared beside the spillway, I realized I was not looking at old family records anymore. I was looking at evidence, and every drawing, every signature, every inspection report pointed toward the same simple truth. The dam had never been built for convenience, beauty, or recreation. It had been built because somebody had already learned exactly what happened when this valley tried to hold back a mountain without it. From that day forward, I stopped thinking like a homeowner defending his property and started thinking like the engineer I had been trained to become. I cleared the entire workbench and organized every document in chronological order. Original construction permits, county correspondence, maintenance inspections, watershed studies, elevation surveys, handwritten field notes from my grandfather. The smell of old paper mixed with cedar from the workshop shelves while afternoon sunlight spilled across decades of engineering history. Each document answered one question, and together they answered every question Karen had never bothered to ask. I spent the next several evenings comparing those records with modern county mapping software. Satellite imagery, updated floodplain maps, and watershed boundaries lined up almost perfectly with drawings created more than 50 years earlier. That alone impressed me, but the real discovery came from an oversized folder hidden beneath several inspection reports. Inside was a complete hydrology study prepared shortly before construction began. Rainfall calculations covered page after page, followed by projected runoff volumes flowing from thousands of acres of mountain terrain above our valley. The final pages explained exactly why the earthen dam had been placed where it was. It was not designed to create a scenic reservoir. It was positioned at the only location capable of slowing peak runoff before floodwater reached the lower valley, where today's subdivision now stood. I quietly leaned back in my chair while the workshop fan hummed overhead. Every expensive house Karen represented had been built decades after the flood control system already existed. The neighborhood had not created the dam. The dam had made the neighborhood possible. The following morning, I drove to the county records office carrying several document numbers copied from the old files. The archive clerk disappeared into a storage room and returned with additional engineering binders that had not been opened in years. Together, we carefully unfolded oversized drainage district maps covering nearly the entire watershed. Colored contour lines stretched across the paper like fingerprints left by the mountains themselves. Every drainage channel eventually pointed toward the same reservoir behind my property. More importantly, the county maps identified the embankment as an active flood mitigation structure rather than a private landscaping feature. That single designation changed everything. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant record along with historical maintenance agreements and agency correspondence. The clerk smiled politely and mentioned that very few people ever asked to see those files anymore because the system had quietly done its job for decades. Driving home through the subdivision, I noticed families walking dogs, children riding bicycles, and lawn crews trimming perfect rows of grass. Life looked peaceful because nobody had spent years worrying about seasonal flooding. They assumed the valley had always been safe. Karen assumed the same thing. She believed safety came from attractive neighborhoods and organized board meetings. I now held enough evidence to prove that the quiet stretch of grass she wanted removed had been protecting every mailbox, driveway, and front porch below it long before the first homeowners association meeting was ever scheduled. For the first time since this entire dispute began, I closed the last binder with complete confidence. I no longer needed to convince Karen she was wrong. I only needed to place the truth in front of the people whose responsibility was protecting the valley, because engineering calculations never cared about popularity, and floodwater had never once stopped to read a homeowners association rulebook. I did not wait for the public hearing. By then, I had already learned something far more valuable than winning an argument. The right evidence placed in the right hands always travels farther than the loudest speech. Instead of preparing a presentation for the Homeowners Association Board, I spent an entire weekend assembling a single binder that contained everything I had uncovered. The Certified Flood Mitigation designation came first. Behind it came the original county construction permits, the hydrology study, watershed calculations, historical maintenance records, inspection reports, and updated floodplain maps showing exactly how runoff moved through the valley during major storms. Every page carried official stamps, engineering seals, or county references. Nothing depended on my opinion. Monday morning, I drove to the county engineering office before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The building smelled like polished tile, fresh printer paper, and brewed coffee drifting from a small break room near the lobby. I requested a meeting with the county floodplain administrator and quietly placed the binder on the conference table. She spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing the documents without interruption. Occasionally, she highlighted a paragraph or compared one drawing against another map displayed on her computer screen. Finally, she looked up and asked one simple question. Has anyone from the Homeowners Association contacted our office before issuing these violation notices? I shook my head. She nodded slowly, picked up the telephone, and made 2 calls I could not hear. When I left the building that afternoon, I did not know exactly what would happen next. I only knew the people responsible for flood control finally had the complete story. 2 days later, several White County trucks arrived near the reservoir just after sunrise. Engineers unloaded survey equipment, digital mapping tablets, laser levels, and large rolled drawings. They walked the crest of the dam with careful precision while another team inspected the spillway, drainage channel, and outlet structure. Karen appeared a few minutes later carrying the same leather folder she always brought to board meetings. She greeted everyone confidently and explained that the community was simply removing an obsolete dirt barrier to improve neighborhood recreation. The lead engineer listened politely before asking whether she had reviewed the historical flood mitigation designation or the county watershed files before issuing the violation. Karen hesitated for the first time since this entire dispute began. She admitted she had relied on internal homeowners association records because she believed the structure served only private property. The engineer quietly unfolded one of the original watershed maps across the hood of his truck. Even from several yards away, I recognized the familiar contour lines flowing down from the mountains. He pointed toward the reservoir, traced the drainage basin with his finger, and then continued all the way through the subdivision below. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but Karen's expression changed completely. The confidence she had carried for weeks slowly disappeared as she realized the piece of land she wanted removed had never belonged solely to me. It had always been part of a much larger system designed to protect an entire valley, and for the first time, she was hearing that truth from the people who had been responsible for it all along. The county engineers returned the following week carrying equipment I recognized immediately from my own field work. Survey drones lifted quietly into the cool morning air while laser levels flashed across the grassy crest of the embankment. Tablet screens displayed contour maps in real time as technicians walked the drainage channel, measuring elevations that had not changed in decades. The smell of damp soil mixed with fresh pine carried across the reservoir, while the steady sound of flowing water echoed through the spillway exactly as it always had. Nothing about the dam behaved like an abandoned pile of dirt. Every component performed exactly as the original design intended. Karen stood nearby with several homeowners association board members watching the inspection unfold in complete silence. Their colorful trail renderings remained tucked inside the same leather folder that had seemed so important only days earlier. Nobody unfolded them now. The engineers were asking different questions. They wanted maintenance history, runoff records, inspection intervals, and historical rainfall events. Those happened to be the exact records my family had preserved for more than 50 years. I handed over binders one by one while the lead hydrologist compared my father's handwritten inspection logs against county archives stored on his computer. Every date matched. Every maintenance visit matched. Every recommendation matched. At one point he looked up from the paperwork, smiled slightly, and said that very few privately maintained flood structures remained this thoroughly documented. Hearing those words felt less like praise and more like confirmation that my father and grandfather had spent their lives protecting something worth preserving. By early afternoon, dark clouds began gathering over the mountains to the west. Summer storms moved quickly through this valley, and everyone living here understood how suddenly heavy rain could arrive. The inspectors continued working while distant thunder rolled across the foothills. Within an hour, a steady rain began falling. First as a gentle tapping across the reservoir, and then as a constant curtain of water stretching across the valley. Small streams formed along the surrounding hillsides exactly where the watershed maps predicted they would. I watched the reservoir rise gradually while runoff entered through natural drainage channels feeding directly toward the dam. The spillway accepted the increased flow without hesitation, releasing water downstream at the controlled rate engineers had designed decades earlier. The county team paused their measurements long enough to observe the system operating under real storm conditions. Nobody needed a presentation anymore. The valley itself became the demonstration. Karen stood beneath a large umbrella watching water collect behind the embankment instead of racing unchecked toward the subdivision below. The lead engineer quietly pointed toward the calm spillway and then toward the neighborhood resting safely downstream. Even from several yards away, I could see understanding replace certainty across Karen's face. She was no longer looking at an obstacle interrupting her walking trail. She was watching living infrastructure perform the very job it had been built to do. As the rain slowly eased and sunlight broke through the clouds, the reservoir settled back into quiet ripples. The inspection team packed their equipment with far fewer questions than they had arrived with, because the storm had answered the most important one on its own. Some structures explain themselves best when nature decides to speak first. 3 days after the inspection, the county released its findings. I received the report by electronic mail just before sunrise while standing on the crest of the dam, watching a layer of morning mist drift across the calm reservoir. The first sentence immediately caught my attention. The structure had been formally recognized as an active flood mitigation facility, serving the surrounding watershed and providing downstream protection beyond the boundaries of my property. Everything that followed simply confirmed what my grandfather, my father, and generations of county engineers had known all along. The report recommended continued preservation, ongoing maintenance, and coordination with local flood control authorities. More importantly, It stated that no modifications affecting the structure should proceed without review by the appropriate public agencies. Less than an hour later, another message arrived, this time from the Homeowners Association. The board had called an emergency meeting that same evening. I attended quietly, carrying nothing except a thin folder containing the county report. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt completely different from previous meetings. Instead of colorful trail renderings decorating the front wall, copies of engineering maps and inspection summaries rested on every table. Karen entered without the confident smile she usually carried. She thanked everyone for attending, cleared her throat, and announced that new information had fundamentally changed the board's understanding of the reservoir and the dam. She explained that the county investigation had confirmed the structure was part of an established flood control system with documented historical significance and continuing public safety value. One board member slowly raised his hand and asked whether the $50,000 violation would remain in effect. Karen looked down at the report before answering. The board had unanimously voted to withdraw every notice, cancel every financial penalty, and recognize the previous enforcement action as being based on incomplete information. The room became unusually quiet. Nobody applauded. Nobody argued. Several homeowners simply looked toward the large windows overlooking the reservoir as though they were seeing it for the first time. A retired firefighter stood and shared that he had responded to flooding in another county years earlier, where similar protective infrastructure had failed because maintenance had been neglected. His comments shifted the conversation completely. The discussion was no longer about improving views or expanding recreational space. It became about understanding the systems quietly protecting communities every day without attracting attention. Before the meeting ended, the county floodplain administrator addressed the room through a video conference. She thanked my family for preserving decades of maintenance records and encouraged the association to work cooperatively with property owners whenever infrastructure history was unclear. Karen stood once more and offered a sincere public apology for assuming appearance mattered more than purpose. I accepted it with a simple nod because the outcome had never been about proving someone wrong. It had always been about making sure the right people understood what stood behind that grassy embankment. As everyone slowly left the clubhouse, the evening sky reflected across the quiet reservoir outside, and for the first time since this dispute began, the dam was no longer being discussed as an obstacle. It had finally been recognized for what it had always been, a silent guardian that had protected the valley for generations without ever asking to be noticed. The seasons changed, but the dam never changed its purpose. By late autumn, the cottonwood leaves had turned golden. The mornings carried the crisp scent of cold mountain air, and the reservoir reflected clear blue skies as quietly as it always had. Every Saturday, I continued the routine my father taught me decades earlier. I walked the crest with a clipboard, inspected the spillway, checked the outlet pipe, cleared fallen branches from the drainage channel, and recorded the water level in the maintenance log that now held 3 generations of handwriting. The work was never dramatic, and that was exactly the point. Good infrastructure rarely attracts attention when it is doing its job. Several weeks after the county released its report, a new sign appeared beside the gravel maintenance road leading onto the embankment. It was not bright red like the violation notice that had started this entire ordeal. It was a simple metal marker installed by the county. The words were straightforward. Protected flood mitigation infrastructure. Authorized access only. I stopped for a moment and ran my hand across the cool metal surface. It was a small change, but it meant the valley would never again mistake the dam for an abandoned mound of dirt. Karen eventually visited one quiet afternoon, carrying nothing except a folded letter. The confidence that once defined every conversation had been replaced by something far more genuine. She admitted that she had focused so heavily on appearance that she never considered the engineering hidden beneath the landscape. She also explained that the Homeowners Association had approved new procedures requiring consultation with county agencies before proposing changes involving drainage systems, easements, or historical infrastructure. I thanked her for taking the time to come. We spoke for only a few minutes before she quietly walked back toward the neighborhood, leaving the valley exactly as she had found it. Winter arrived with several heavy snowstorms, followed by a rapid spring thaw that filled streams flowing down from the mountains. One afternoon I stood on the embankment while cold runoff entered the reservoir exactly as the original calculations predicted more than 50 years earlier. The water level rose steadily, paused behind the dam, and then moved safely through the spillway at the controlled rate. Designed by engineers who understood this valley long before expensive homes covered the hillsides below, children continued riding bicycles through dry streets. Families enjoyed peaceful evenings on their back patios. Most of them never noticed the reservoir quietly doing its work beyond the trees, and I hoped they never would. My grandfather once told me that success in engineering is measured by disasters that never happen. At the time, I thought he was simply being modest. Standing there with the smell of wet earth, pine trees, and fresh mountain water filling the cool spring air, I finally understood exactly what he meant. People believed the dam was holding back water. In truth, it had always been holding back consequences. The violation notice disappeared long ago, but the lesson remained. Some structures earn respect because they are beautiful. Others earn it because they quietly protect lives every single day. Justice did not arrive with shouting, revenge, or celebration. It arrived through patience, records, measurements, and the simple truth that purpose will always outlast appearances when people are willing to look beneath the surface.